My name is Desmond Whitlock. I am 41 years old. 6 months ago, I sat at a long table in the Fort Collins City Council chambers. A manila folder in front of me labeled case number 2025-114, the Bramwell Crossing Mixed-Use Development. My stepfather, Curtis Bramwell, had spent 32 years making sure everyone in that family understood I was Sandra's son, not his, a phrase he used so often growing up that I stopped hearing it as an insult and started hearing it as simply my name. He never hit me. He never screamed. He just built an entire household around the idea that I was a guest who happened to live there, an arrangement so quiet and so consistent that by the time I was 12, I had learned not to expect a key to my own front door. What Curtis did not know, walking into that hearing room in a blazer he'd bought specifically for the occasion, was that the staff planner who had spent 4 months reviewing every stormwater calculation and traffic study behind his company's biggest project in a decade was the stepson he had spent 3 decades explaining away. Let me take you back to how a boy who was never quite family became the man holding the only signature that mattered. I grew up, for the first 9 years of my life, in a small rental house on the edge of Loveland, Colorado, with my mother, Sandra, and my biological father, a long-haul truck driver named Gerald Whitlock who died in a highway accident outside Cheyenne when I was 7. I do not remember him with the kind of clarity I wish I had. I remember the smell of diesel and peppermint gum that seemed to follow him into every room, and I remember a single afternoon, the summer before he died, when he let me sit on his lap and steer his truck across an empty gravel lot at maybe 2 miles an hour, both of us laughing so hard my mother came outside to see what the noise was. My mother worked 2 jobs after he died, days at a dental office in Loveland and evenings restocking shelves at a grocery store on Eisenhower Boulevard, and I spent most of those 2 years being watched by an elderly neighbor named Mrs. Alcott, who fed me saltine crackers with peanut butter and let me watch nature documentaries on a television with a station dial that only half worked. I did not understand, at 7, what it meant to lose a father. I understood it slowly, in pieces, over years, mostly in the specific way certain smells or sounds would ambush me without warning. A diesel engine idling at a stoplight, the particular creak of a truck door. My mother met Curtis Bramwell when I was 8, at a Rotary Club fundraiser she attended with a coworker, and they married 11 months later in a small ceremony at a church in Fort Collins that Curtis's own family had attended for 2 generations. Curtis was, by every outward measure, a good match for my mother. He ran a modest but growing construction and development company, Bramwell Builders, founded by his own father in the 1960s, and he had 2 children from his first marriage, a boy named Preston who was 2 years older than me, and a girl named Whitney who was 4 years younger. I want to be precise about something here because it matters for everything that follows. Curtis was never cruel to me in any way a stranger would have recognized. He never raised his voice at me specifically. He never denied me food, shelter, or the basic material things a child needs. What he did, instead, was something quieter and harder to name, something that took me until my 30s to fully articulate even to myself. He simply never let me become a Bramwell, not in any way that counted, and he did it so gradually and so consistently that by the time I was old enough to notice the pattern, it had already calcified into the architecture of our entire household. The house Curtis moved us into, a large 2-story colonial on the west side of Fort Collins near City Park, had been in his family for over 20 years by the time my mother and I arrived. I remember walking through it for the first time, 9 years old, running my hand along a banister that felt like it belonged to someone else's childhood, and feeling, even then, a specific unease I could not name. Preston and Whitney had their own bedrooms already decorated. Preston's walls covered in dinosaur wallpaper his mother had chosen before she passed away from cancer 2 years earlier. Whitney's room painted a soft yellow with a border of painted rabbits circling the ceiling. I was given the smallest bedroom in the house, a converted study off the back hallway that still had a built-in bookshelf bolted to one wall and a window that looked out onto the garage roof instead of the backyard. Nobody discussed this arrangement with me. Nobody asked whether I wanted a different room or a chance to help choose paint. It was simply decided, the way most things involving me were simply decided, without a conversation attached to the decision. I want to tell you about the key, because it is a small detail, and small details are usually where the real truth of a family lives. When Preston turned 12, Curtis took him to the hardware store on Mulberry Street and had a copy of the front door key cut specifically for him. A small ceremony that Curtis described afterward, at dinner, as the day a boy becomes responsible for his own house. When Whitney turned 12, 4 years later, the same ceremony happened again, the same trip to the same hardware store, the same speech about responsibility delivered at the same dinner table. I turned 12 the year in between, and no one mentioned a key. I did not receive my own key to that house until I was 16, and even then, it arrived without ceremony, tossed to me across the kitchen counter by my mother one Tuesday evening because she was tired of waiting up to let me in after track practice. I noticed. I always noticed. I simply learned, very early, that noticing out loud cost more than it was worth. Curtis ran Bramwell Builders out of a small office on College Avenue, and by the time I was in middle school, the company had grown enough to employ nearly 20 people, building custom homes and small commercial properties across northern Colorado. Preston started working summers at the company office when he turned 14, filing permits and running blueprints between the office and job sites, tasks Curtis described, proudly, as the boy learning the family business from the ground up. I asked that same summer whether I could work there too, mostly because I wanted the same thing every 14-year-old wants, which is a reason to belong somewhere. Curtis told me the company was not hiring, and 2 weeks later I saw a new hire, a neighbor's son named Jordan Meeks, running the exact blueprint errands I had asked to run myself. I did not say anything about it at dinner that night. I had already learned, by 14, that pointing out an inconsistency in how Curtis treated me rarely produced an apology. It mostly produced a longer, more elaborate explanation for why the inconsistency was not actually what it looked like. My mother saw some of this, though never all of it, and what she saw, she mostly tried to smooth over rather than confront directly. She was a woman who had lost a husband young and remarried into a household that came with its own established order. And I think, looking back now with the clarity that comes only with distance, that she felt she did not have the standing to fight Curtis on every small omission without risking the stability she had worked so hard to rebuild for us. She loved me. I never once doubted that. But her love operated inside a set of limits Curtis had drawn around our family long before she arrived, and she navigated those limits the way a person navigates a house with furniture rearranged in the dark, careful, apologetic, occasionally bruised. She would slip me a few extra dollars before school trips Curtis had decided were optional for me, but mandatory for Preston and Whitney. She would find small, private moments, folding laundry together on a Sunday afternoon, to tell me she saw how hard I worked and that it mattered even if nobody said so out loud. Those moments were real, and I held on to them tightly for years. But they were also, unmistakably, moments that happened in private, never at the dinner table, never in front of Curtis, as though even my mother understood that some truths in that house could only survive in whispers. I found something that year, though, that mattered more than I understood at the time. Our middle school sat 2 blocks from the old Fort Collins Municipal Building, where the city's planning department kept its offices on the 2nd floor above the public library branch. I started walking there after school instead of going straight home, partly because the library was warm and quiet, and partly, if I am honest, because home had begun to feel like a place I was tolerated rather than wanted. I would sit at a table near the reference section for an hour most afternoons, doing homework, sometimes just reading whatever caught my eye, delaying the walk back to a house where my own bedroom overlooked a garage roof. It was there, the winter I turned 13, that I met Vivian Kessler for the first time. She was 61 that year, a retired assistant city planner who had spent 28 years working for the city of Fort Collins before retiring, and she still came into the municipal building most afternoons to volunteer with a citizen advisory committee on land use. Mostly, she told me later, because retirement without purpose had nearly driven her out of her mind within the first 6 months. She noticed me before I noticed her, a boy who showed up at the same table every afternoon for weeks, always alone, always lingering longer than homework required. One Tuesday in February, she sat down across from me with 2 cups of hot chocolate from the vending machine downstairs, set one in front of me without asking, and said, plainly, "You've been sitting here for 6 weeks. I figure it's time somebody asked your name." I want to describe that first afternoon in a little more detail, because I have replayed it in my mind more times than almost any other memory from my childhood. Vivian was wearing a wool coat the color of rust, and she smelled faintly of the peppermints she kept in a tin in her coat pocket, a smell that, oddly, reminded me a little of my biological father, though I never told her that until years later. She asked me what grade I was in, and when I told her 7th, she asked whether I liked school, and when I said it was fine, she said, plainly, "Fine is not an answer, it's a wall. Try again." Nobody had ever talked to me that directly before, and I remember feeling, in that instant, a strange mixture of embarrassment and relief, the particular feeling of being seen clearly by someone who was not going to let me hide behind a polite non-answer. I told her school was fine because nobody there knew enough about me to ask harder questions, and that I preferred it that way. She nodded slowly, as though I had told her something important, and did not push further that first day. I did not tell Vivian much that first afternoon, mostly small talk about school and the cold outside. But something in the way she asked questions made me want to keep coming back, a kind of genuine curiosity I was not used to receiving from adults in my own house. Over the following months, our conversations deepened, and I found myself telling her things I had never said out loud to anyone, about the bedroom over the garage, about the key I did not have, about the summer job I did not get. Vivian never told me Curtis was wrong, not directly, not in those early years. She mostly just listened and asked good questions, and occasionally said something that reframed the whole situation for me without ever naming Curtis by name. I remember her telling me once, that winter, that some people build a family the way a contractor builds a house, according to a set of blueprints drawn up long before anyone new arrived, and that sometimes the blueprints simply never get revised, no matter how long the new person lives inside the walls. I did not fully understand what she meant at 13. I understood it completely by the time I was 30. I want to tell you about one particular Saturday with Vivian, because it captures something I have never quite managed to explain to people who did not grow up the way I did. I was 14, and Vivian invited me to help her catalog a box of old zoning maps the city had discovered in a storage closet during a building renovation. Maps dating back to the 1950s that nobody had properly filed in decades. We spent an entire Saturday afternoon at a long table in the basement of the municipal building, unfolding brittle paper maps and matching them against a modern parcel index. Vivian narrating small pieces of city history as we went. Which street had been a dirt road until 1962, which block had been rezoned 3 times before anyone settled on what it should actually become. She paid me $8 an hour out of her own pocket for that work, cash from an envelope she kept in her desk drawer, and told me plainly that a person's first paycheck should always come from work that actually mattered, even if the amount was small. I still have $4 from that first envelope, folded into a small square, tucked inside the cover of an old field notebook I keep in my desk at the planning office to this day. It is not worth anything as currency. It is worth almost everything as evidence that someone, once, decided my time and my attention were valuable enough to pay for, at an age when my own house had not yet managed to hand me a house key. Vivian became, over the following years, something between a mentor and a second mother to me, though neither of us used those words for a long time. She showed me the mechanics of how a city actually worked, the zoning maps taped to the walls of the planning office, the public hearing notices posted in the lobby, the specific, unglamorous machinery of permits and code enforcement and comprehensive plans that most people never think about until it directly affects them. She let me sit in on public meetings starting when I was 14, introducing me to colleagues as a young man with a serious interest in how cities get built. A description that made me sit up straighter every single time I heard it, because it was the first time in my life an adult had described me as serious about anything. She cost herself something for this, too, though I did not understand the full weight of it until much later. She used her own volunteer hours, technically meant for the advisory committee, to mentor a teenager who was not her responsibility in any official sense. She fielded a complaint once from a colleague who thought she was overstepping by letting a local kid wander freely through a municipal office. And she absorbed that friction quietly, without ever mentioning it to me until years afterward, over coffee, long after I had my own badge and my own desk in that same building. The wrongs in my house did not arrive all at once. They arrived the way water finds a crack in a foundation, slowly, then suddenly, then permanently, until the whole structure has to account for the damage. The first wrong, the one that set the pattern for everything after it, came the summer I turned 15, when Curtis took Preston on a father-son fishing trip to a cabin near Steamboat Springs that had belonged to the Bramwell family for 3 generations. It was an annual trip, one Curtis had taken with his own father as a boy, and one he had already taken with Preston twice before. That 3rd summer, I asked, carefully, whether I could come along, framing it as a chance to learn to fly fish rather than a request to be included as a son. Curtis told me the cabin only slept too comfortably, and that the trip was really a Bramwell tradition. a phrase he used without any apparent awareness of what it implied about my own place in the family he had built around me. My mother pushed back gently that year. I found out later, suggesting the family look into a second cabin or a different weekend for me specifically. And Curtis told her, in a conversation I was not meant to overhear from the hallway, that he did not think it was fair to Preston to dilute a tradition that had always been just the two of them. I stood in that hallway at 15, my hand still on the banister I had never quite gotten used to, and I understood with a clarity that surprised me that fairness in that house had a very specific shape, and it was not a shape that included me. That was the first wrong. Exclusion, delivered as tradition, the same excuse families use to protect an old shape at the expense of anyone new trying to fit inside it. The second wrong came 3 years later, at Preston's wedding. The summer I turned 18 and had just finished my first year at Colorado State University, studying urban planning on Vivian's quiet, persistent encouragement. I flew back from a summer internship in Denver specifically for the ceremony, taking 2 days of unpaid leave I genuinely could not afford, because Preston had called me himself and asked me to be there. One of the few times in our shared childhood he had reached across the invisible line Curtis had drawn between us. The wedding itself was lovely, held at a vineyard outside Fort Collins, and I sat near the back with my mother, genuinely happy for Preston in a way that surprised even me. During the father of the groom toast, Curtis stood, raised his glass, and spoke for nearly 10 minutes about watching my children grow into the people they became, naming Preston, naming Whitney, describing specific memories from each of their childhoods with real warmth in his voice. He did not mention me once, not by name, not by implication, in a toast about his children delivered to nearly 150 guests, many of whom had known our blended family for over a decade. My mother's hand found mine under the table partway through that toast and gripped it hard enough to leave a mark. I smiled through it, the way I had learned to smile through most things in that family, and I clapped when everyone else clapped, and I told myself, on the drive back to my dorm 2 days later, that it did not matter, that I did not need Curtis's toast to know who I was. I told myself that for years before I fully admitted how much it had actually cost me. That was the second wrong. Erasure, delivered in public, at an event where I had shown up specifically because I still believed showing up mattered. The third wrong, the one that finally reorganized something permanent in me, came 14 years later, the year Bramwell Builders celebrated its 50th anniversary as a company, an event Curtis had been planning for the better part of 2 years. By then I had built my own career quietly, first as a junior planner for the city of Loveland, then, 7 years later, as a senior planner for the city of Fort Collins itself. Work I rarely discussed at family gatherings because I had learned, decades earlier, that my professional life did not register as interesting inside that house the way Preston's expanding role at Bramwell Builders always did. The anniversary celebration included a printed retrospective booklet, distributed to nearly 300 guests and mailed to clients and business partners across 3 counties, tracing the company's history from Curtis's father's first job site in 1975 through 5 decades of growth. The booklet included a full page titled The Bramwell Family, featuring photographs of Curtis, his late first wife, Preston, Whitney, Preston's own 2 young children, and my mother. I was not in a single photograph. I was not mentioned in a single sentence. I read that booklet standing in the parking lot of the event hall before I had even gone inside, my mother beside me, her face going pale as she flipped through the same pages I was reading. She had not known. Curtis had handled the booklet's production himself, working with a graphic designer at his office, and had simply, without any conversation, decided which family members belonged on that page and which did not. I want to be honest about what that moment did to me. It was not the sharpest pain I had ever felt in that family. It was, somehow, worse than sharp. It was final, printed, mailed to 300 people, a permanent document stating, in ink, exactly what 32 years of smaller omissions had already told me. That was the third wrong. Erasure made official, printed, distributed, and impossible to later explain away as an oversight. I did not confront Curtis that night, standing in that parking lot with my mother's hand shaking slightly in mine. I walked into that anniversary party, shook hands with people I had known my whole life, congratulated Preston on the company's growth, and drove home 3 hours later in a silence so complete I do not remember passing a single mile marker on Highway 287. My mother called me the next morning, crying, apologizing for something that was never actually hers to apologize for, and I told her, gently, that I did not need her to fix what Curtis had built. I told her I needed her to know that I saw it clearly now, all of it, the room over the garage, the key at 16, the fishing trip, the toast, and now this booklet, and that I had finally stopped waiting for any of it to add up to something different than what it plainly was. I want to walk you through what I did next, because I did not do anything dramatic, and I think that matters. I did not write Curtis a letter. I did not stage a confrontation at a holiday dinner. I simply stopped auditioning for a family that had already, decades earlier, decided the shape it intended to keep. I stopped attending the smaller gatherings, the ones that did not involve my mother directly. I kept showing up for her, for birthdays, and for the handful of holidays she specifically asked me to attend, but I stopped extending myself toward Curtis, Preston, or Whitney in any way that required me to keep hoping for something that 32 years of evidence told me was not coming. My wife, Renata, whom I had married 4 years earlier, watched this shift happen without ever pushing me toward reconciliation or away from it. She had met Curtis exactly twice before that anniversary party, both times at events where she noticed, quietly, the same pattern I had spent a lifetime not naming out loud. She told me once, driving home from a smaller family dinner the following spring, that she had watched Curtis introduce me to a business associate that evening as Sandra's son. The same phrase he had used my entire childhood, and that something about hearing it as an adult, from a grown man introducing another grown man, struck her as almost stranger than it would have as a child. I told her it was the same sentence I had heard my whole life. She said that did not make it any less strange. I have thought about that observation more times than I can count in the years since. The years that followed were quiet, in the specific way that building something real is almost always quiet. I earned my master's degree in urban and regional planning at Colorado State, the same program Vivian had once pointed me toward with a stack of course catalogs she brought to our regular coffee meetings, insisting, gently but firmly, that a career built on genuine expertise was the one thing nobody could ever take from me or erase from a booklet. I took an entry-level position with the city of Loveland at 24, reviewing minor subdivision plats and variance requests, work that felt, at the time, almost absurdly technical compared to the emotional terrain I had grown up navigating. I found something in that technical precision that steadied me. A stormwater calculation either meets code or it does not. A setback requirement either complies with the zoning ordinance or it does not. For the first time in my life, I was operating inside a system where the rules applied equally to everyone, regardless of whose last name was on the application. I moved to the city of Fort Collins 7 years later, taking a position as a senior planner in the Community Development and Neighborhood Services Department. Work that eventually put me on the technical review team for major development applications across the city. Everything from small infill projects to large-scale mixed-use developments requiring extensive traffic studies, stormwater management plans, and public hearings before the Planning and Zoning Board. I built a reputation over those years, slowly and without any particular fanfare, as a planner who read every page of every submission personally rather than delegating the detail work to junior staff. A habit that occasionally frustrated developers hoping for a faster rubber stamp. But that earned me, over time, a level of professional respect I had genuinely never expected to feel anywhere, let alone in a career my own family had never once asked a real question about. I was promoted to lead planner for major developments the year I turned 38, a role that put me at the head of the technical review committee for any project requesting a rezoning or a planned unit development above a certain size threshold. Vivian remained a fixture in my life through all of it, though her role shifted gradually from mentor to something closer to family as the years passed. She retired fully from her volunteer committee work when she turned 70, but she still met me for coffee most Thursday mornings at a small diner near the old municipal building, a habit we had kept for nearly 3 decades by the time this story reaches its center. She had never married and had no children of her own, a fact she mentioned to me once, plainly over coffee, telling me that she had made peace with that absence a long time ago because life had, in her words, handed her a kid anyway, just later than most people get one, and in a stranger shape than most people expect. She said it so simply that I did not fully register the weight of the sentence until I was driving home afterward, gripping the wheel a little tighter than the moment required. Vivian attended my wedding to Renata, seated in the second row, closer to the front than Curtis and my mother, a seating decision Renata and I made deliberately and without a single moment of debate between us. Vivian cried through the entire ceremony. She told me later, not from sadness, but from a kind of pride, she said she had never expected to feel that intensely for someone else's happiness. She gave a short toast at our reception, the only toast of the evening besides my best man's, and she told the room, plainly, that she had watched a boy sit alone in a library for 6 weeks before anyone thought to ask his name, and that she considered it the finest piece of civic work she had ever done in 28 years with the city. Mentoring a kid nobody else in that building was responsible for. Renata told me afterward that she had never seen me cry at anything the way I cried during that toast, and I told her, honestly, that no one had ever said anything like that about me before, in any room, at any point in my life. I built a life with Renata over those years that I am, even now, still slightly amazed by, in the quiet way you are amazed by something you once believed you did not deserve. We bought a small brick bungalow near City Park, 4 blocks from the same municipal building where Vivian first bought me a cup of hot chocolate, and we had 2 children, a daughter named Della and a son named Emmett, both of whom grew up calling Vivian Grandma Vive, without either Renata or I ever formally deciding that title. It simply arrived on its own, the way true things sometimes do. Curtis met Della and Emmett a handful of times over the years. At the smaller family gatherings, I still occasionally attended for my mother's sake. And he was pleasant enough with them in the distant, formal way he had always been pleasant with me, a warmth that never quite closed the final few inches of distance. My mother, for her part, grew closer to my children than Curtis ever managed to, visiting our house on her own most Sunday afternoons, a habit that had started, quietly, not long after the anniversary booklet, as though some part of her had finally decided which household deserved her full presence. The trigger, when it finally arrived, came almost exactly 2 years ago, in the form of a pre-application meeting request filed with the city's Community Development Department by Bramwell Builders, now operating under a slightly rebranded name, Bramwell Development Group, reflecting the company's shift over the previous decade from custom homes toward larger commercial and mixed-use projects. The application concerned a 12-acre parcel along the Mulberry Corridor, a proposed mixed-use development called Bramwell Crossing, combining retail space, structured parking, and 84 residential units. A project valued, according to the initial application materials, at just over $31 million. I did not connect the applicant name to my own family at first glance, since the application listed the project manager as Preston Bramwell, now serving as the company's vice president of development, rather than Curtis directly. It was only when I pulled the ownership records during our standard intake review that I saw Curtis Bramwell listed as the company's majority owner and the application's ultimate responsible party. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, sitting at my own desk with a case file that suddenly had my stepfather's name on it. I did not feel triumphant. I felt, mostly, a kind of clean, professional alarm, the recognition that I now needed to handle a genuine conflict of interest correctly before anything else happened, regardless of any history sitting underneath the paperwork. I walked directly to my supervisor's office that same afternoon and disclosed the relationship in full, explaining that Curtis Bramwell was my stepfather, that our relationship had been distant and difficult for most of my life, and that I wanted the department's standard conflict of interest protocol applied immediately rather than deciding informally, on my own, whether I could review the application fairly. My supervisor, a careful, exacting woman named Marisol Delgado, who had run our department's technical review process for nearly a decade, told me she appreciated the disclosure and that we would follow the same process the city used for any staff conflict, full documentation of the relationship in the case file, and a mandatory second reviewer sign-off on every technical finding before it went to me for final consolidation. I agreed immediately, relieved in a strange way to have a formal process standing between me and a decision that had nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with 3 decades of dinner tables. I learned, over the following weeks, exactly how much was riding on this specific project for Curtis, information that came to me not through any effort of my own, but through the ordinary channels of a small city where everyone eventually hears everything. Bramwell Development Group had overextended itself significantly on 2 prior commercial projects in Loveland and Windsor, both of which had underperformed financial projections due to construction delays and rising material costs. Bramwell Crossing was, by every account I later pieced together from public records and industry contacts, the project Curtis was counting on to stabilize the company's finances after nearly 5 years of thinning margins, a fact that explained, in hindsight, why the application had arrived with an unusually aggressive timeline attached to it, and why Curtis himself, unusually for a project this size, had begun attending preliminary meetings personally rather than sending Preston alone, as had become his more typical practice in recent years. The technical review itself took nearly 4 months, longer than average for a project of this size, largely because the original submission contained significant gaps in its stormwater management plan and traffic impact analysis. Gaps that our second reviewer, a meticulous engineer named Owen Castellano, who had worked in the department for 11 years, flagged independently before I ever saw the file myself. I want to be clear about something here, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. I did not go looking for problems in Curtis's application. I did not need to. The problems were simply there in the paperwork itself, the way problems in a poorly engineered project are always there for anyone trained to look closely enough. The proposed stormwater detention pond, as originally designed, was undersized by nearly 30% relative to the parcel's actual impervious surface calculations, a shortfall that would have sent stormwater directly into an already stressed section of the Spring Creek drainage basin during any significant rain event. The traffic impact study, commissioned by Bramwell Development Group from an outside consultant, had used outdated trip generation data that understated the project's actual impact on the Mulberry and Lemay intersection by a meaningful margin, an intersection already operating close to capacity during evening rush hour. I met with Curtis directly only once during the entire 4-month review period, at a pre-scheduled technical meeting in a city conference room, alongside Preston, Owen Castellano, and 2 of Curtis's own engineers. It was the first time in my adult life I had sat across a table from Curtis in a purely professional capacity, and I remember noticing, almost clinically, how differently he behaved in that room compared to every family gathering I could recall. He was attentive. He took notes. He asked clarifying questions of Owen with genuine engagement, the same kind of engagement I had spent 30 years wishing he would direct toward me at a dinner table instead of a conference table. At one point, reviewing the stormwater deficiency together, Curtis looked directly at me, for what felt like the first time in years, and asked, plainly, what it would actually take to bring the detention pond into compliance. I told him, factually, the additional square footage required, the estimated cost range based on comparable projects, and the timeline implications for his construction schedule. He nodded, wrote it down, and said, "Thank you, Desmond," using my actual name, in a tone I did not recognize from any memory I had of him. I did not say anything about the strangeness of that moment in the room itself. I noted it, quietly, the way I had learned to note most things over a lifetime of paying close attention to a family that rarely paid the same attention back to me. The formal public hearing before the Planning and Zoning Board was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in October, in the same council chambers where I had sat through dozens of hearings over the years, though never one carrying quite this particular weight. Nearly 60 members of the public attended, a mix of neighboring property owners concerned about traffic and drainage, a handful of housing advocates supportive of the project's residential density, and several of Curtis's own business associates who had come, I assume, simply to show support for a project the local business community had been discussing for months. My mother did not attend. I had not told her the hearing was happening, in part because I did not want her caught between 2 people she loved in a public room, and in part because I genuinely was not certain, until the week before, exactly how the findings would land or what I would say about them. Curtis sat in the second row, beside Preston, in the same blazer I mentioned earlier, the one Renata told me afterward she recognized from a photograph in the 50th anniversary booklet. I presented the staff report myself, standing at the small podium positioned to the side of the board's raised dais, the same podium I had stood at perhaps 30 times over the years for other projects entirely unconnected to my own life. I want to describe exactly how I approached that presentation, because I think the manner of it matters as much as the content. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at Curtis for longer than the room's normal rhythm required. I walked the board methodically through each finding in the staff report, the stormwater deficiency identified and since partially corrected through a revised design, the traffic impact understatement, and the additional mitigation measures our department was recommending as conditions of approval. The specific code sections each finding was measured against. I recommended approval of the project, with 11 specific conditions attached, a recommendation Owen Castellano had co-signed the week before after our final joint review. I was not there to kill Curtis's project. I had never wanted to kill it. I was there to tell the truth about what the paperwork actually showed, calmly, in front of witnesses, the same way I had told the truth about every project that had ever crossed my desk. The moment that has stayed with me most clearly from that entire evening came near the end of my presentation, when a board member asked a routine procedural question about staff's relationship to the applicant, a question our department's own disclosure policy required be asked on the record for any project with a documented staff conflict. I answered plainly, into the microphone in front of nearly 60 people, that Curtis Bramwell was my stepfather, that I had disclosed the relationship to my supervisor the day I discovered it, and that every technical finding in the report had been independently verified by a second reviewer before reaching my desk. I did not elaborate further. I did not need to. I watched Curtis's face while I said it, the specific stillness that settled over him, not shock exactly, but a kind of recalculation. The look of a man realizing, in real time, in a room full of his own business associates, exactly whose signature had been reviewing his project for 4 months. For the first time in 32 years, Curtis Bramwell had absolutely nothing to say about who I was in relation to him. The board approved the project that night, 7-0, with the 11 conditions attached, a resolution that surprised no one who had actually read the staff report closely, though it visibly surprised several people in the audience who had assumed, incorrectly, that a family connection meant the fix was already in one direction or the other. Curtis approached me afterward, in the hallway outside the chambers, while Preston hung back near the doorway, watching. He did not thank me, not exactly, though he came close to something adjacent to it. He said, quietly, that he had not known I worked on projects of this size anymore. A sentence that told me, more clearly than anything else that night, exactly how little he had ever actually asked about my career over the previous 15 years. I told him simply that the report spoke for itself, and that I hoped the conditions were manageable for his construction timeline. He nodded, and for a moment I thought he might say something more. He did not. He shook my hand, a formal, brief gesture that felt stranger than any handshake I had ever exchanged with a stranger, and he walked back toward Preston, and the two of them left together. I called Vivian from my truck in the parking lot before I had even started the engine, the same way I had called her after nearly every significant moment in my adult life, good and bad, for almost 3 decades. She picked up on the second ring, as she almost always did, and I told her everything: the stillness on Curtis's face, the 7-0 vote, the handshake in the hallway. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished, and then she said the thing I have thought about more than almost anything else from that entire year. She said that I had done exactly what she had always hoped I would learn to do, which was to let the work be the work, and to let the family be whatever it turned out to be, without forcing either one to fix the other. She said that some people spend their whole lives waiting for a single dramatic moment to settle every old account at once, and that real life rarely obliges them, and that the quieter version, a stormwater report read calmly into a public record, was probably truer to how most genuine reckonings actually happen. I sat in that parking lot for a long time after we hung up, the engine still off, the October air cooling through the cracked window, and I felt something I had not expected to feel that night, which was not triumph and was not exactly peace either, but something close to both, settling slowly, the way water finds its level once you stop disturbing it. My mother found out about the hearing 2 days later, from a neighbor who had attended out of general civic interest, and she called me immediately, her voice tight with an emotion I could not immediately identify. She was not angry that I had not told her in advance. She was, she said, once she found the words for it, quietly heartbroken that it had taken 32 years and a public hearing for Curtis to say my actual name in a sentence that acknowledged what I had actually become. I told her I understood why she felt that way, and that I had made my peace with it differently than she had, over many more years than either of us had wanted it to take. She asked me, carefully, whether this meant I would finally let Curtis back in some fuller way than the distant, holiday-only relationship I had maintained for over a decade. I told her honestly that I did not know yet, that I was not interested in punishing him further, but that I was also not interested in pretending 32 years of a locked door and an unlisted name in a family booklet had not happened simply because he had finally shaken my hand in a hallway. I told her the door was not closed. I told her it was also not going to fling itself open just because one evening had gone the way it went. She said she understood, and I believed her, because by then she had spent enough years watching the pattern herself to know exactly what I meant. Whitney, unlike Preston, has never reached out at all, not after the hearing, not after the anniversary booklet years earlier, not at any point in the 3 decades this story spans. I want to mention her honestly rather than leave her out of this account the way I was once left out of a family page, because omitting her entirely would make me guilty of a smaller version of the same thing that was done to me. Whitney was 4 when our parents married, young enough that she never fully understood a version of our household that did not include me, and yet she absorbed Curtis's hierarchy just as completely as Preston did, perhaps more completely, since she had less memory of any other arrangement to compare it against. We are cordial at the rare gatherings where we still overlap, my mother's birthday, an occasional holiday. We have never once had a real conversation about any of this, and I do not know if we ever will. I mention her not because her silence wounded me freshly, but because I think it is honest to say that not every relationship in a story like this one resolves, even after the truth becomes impossible to deny in a public hearing room. Some doors simply stay exactly where they were. Preston reached out to me himself about 3 weeks after the hearing over coffee at the same diner where Vivian and I still met most Thursday mornings, a fact I mentioned to him partly to see whether he understood the significance of the location. He did not entirely, though he listened carefully when I explained it. Preston told me plainly that he had spent most of his adult life simply accepting the shape of our family as fixed. The way a person accepts the floor plan of a house they grew up in without ever questioning why a particular room ended up smaller than the others. He said watching me stand at that podium had been the first time he had ever consciously registered how much smaller my room actually was, and had always been, compared to his and Whitney's. He apologized, somewhat awkwardly, for never having said anything about it over the years, not at the wedding, not at the anniversary party, not at any of the smaller moments in between. I told him I appreciated the apology, and that I did not think it was entirely his to carry alone, since he had been a child inside the same architecture Curtis had built, same as I had, just standing on a different floor of it. We have had coffee together 3 or 4 times since then, tentative, careful conversations that I would not yet call a repaired relationship, but that I also would not dismiss as nothing. Curtis and I have spoken twice since the hearing, both times briefly, both times initiated by him, a fact that still surprises me slightly every time I think about it. The first call came about a month after the hearing, ostensibly to update me on the construction timeline for Bramwell Crossing, a call that had no real professional necessity behind it, since the project had already moved into the standard permitting phase that no longer required my direct involvement. I understood, listening to him talk for longer than the update actually required, that the call was really about something else entirely, something neither of us had the vocabulary to name directly after 32 years of not naming things. The second call came around the holidays, a stilted, careful conversation in which Curtis asked, for what I believe was the first time in my life, how Della and Emmett were doing in school, a question so ordinary and so long overdue that I found myself oddly moved by its very ordinariness. I do not know yet what these calls will eventually become, if anything. I have decided, deliberately, not to rush toward an answer simply because the silence between us finally has something occupying it. What has mattered far more to me than either of those calls, in the months since, is what has continued to be steady and specific in my life, which is the family I actually built rather than the one I spent 32 years hoping might eventually widen enough to include me properly. Vivian turned 84 last spring, and Della and Emmett organized her birthday party themselves, at our house. Insisting on decorating with old zoning maps Vivian had given them years earlier as a joke that became, somehow, a genuine family tradition. Vivian gave a short toast that afternoon, the same as she had at my wedding, and she told the room, plainly, that she had spent 28 years working for a city she loved, and that mentoring a lonely 13-year-old in a library had turned out to be the single most consequential piece of civic infrastructure she had ever helped build, more consequential, she said, than any road or drainage system with her name quietly filed somewhere in a permit record. She cried a little, saying it. So did I. I think often, these days, about the shape of the family I actually assembled, piece by piece, over 3 decades, almost none of it planned in advance. There is Vivian, 84 now, sharper than most people half her age, still meeting me most Thursday mornings at the same diner near the municipal building, still asking better questions about my work than anyone related to me by blood ever managed to. There is Renata, who watched 32 years of small omissions happen in real time without ever once telling me how to feel about them, only asking, patiently, what I needed from her instead. There is Owen Castellano, who has become, over 11 years of shared casework, something closer to a brother than a colleague. The kind of friend who calls on a hard anniversary without needing to be asked why the date matters. There is my mother, who spent decades navigating a marriage that asked her to smooth over what she could never fully fix, and who has, in the years since the hearing, finally stopped apologizing for a household she did not build alone. None of these people owed me the specific kind of attention they gave me. That is, I have come to understand, the entire definition of the family that actually counts. When I sit back and think about all of this now, here's what stands out to me most. Being tolerated is not the same as being wanted, and children know the difference long before they have words for it. I spent years telling myself that a roof, a bed, and a reasonably kind household were enough to call a real home, because I did not yet have the language to name what was actually missing. What was missing was the specific, active choice to include me, the key at 12 instead of 16, the fishing trip, my name in a toast, my photograph on a page. I think about that distinction now whenever I hear someone describe a family as functional simply because no one raised their voice. Quiet exclusion is still exclusion. If you are the person who has always sensed that difference in your own house, I want you to trust that instinct. It is usually right. A family that erases you in small print will eventually erase you in large print too, if nothing interrupts the pattern. Curtis never once, in 32 years, sat me down and told me directly that I was not really his son. He simply left me out of a fishing trip, then a toast, then an entire commemorative booklet mailed to 300 people, each omission a little larger and a little more permanent than the last. I think about that progression whenever someone tells me a slight was probably an accident. One omission might be an accident. A pattern is a decision, repeated until it becomes furniture in the room. The people who choose you without being obligated to are the ones who tell you the truth about what you're actually worth. Vivian owed me nothing. She was not my parent, not my relative, not required by any job description to notice a quiet boy sitting alone in a library for 6 weeks. She noticed anyway, and she kept noticing for nearly 3 decades, at real cost to her own time and her own standing with colleagues who thought she was overstepping. I think about Vivian every time I meet someone who assumes family only means the people you happen to share blood with. Sometimes the realest family is the one that shows up with 2 cups of hot chocolate and no obligation at all attached to the gesture. Doing your job honestly is not the same as seeking revenge, even when the timing makes it feel that way to everyone watching. I did not sabotage Curtis's project. I did not inflate a single finding to make him suffer for 32 years of small cruelties. I found real deficiencies because they were genuinely there, and I reported them the same way I would have reported them for any stranger's application. Because that is the entire job, and because doing it any other way would have made me smaller than the moment required. If you ever find yourself sitting across from someone who hurt you, holding real authority over something that matters to them, I hope you choose the version of yourself that does the job correctly rather than the version that finally gets to be cruel back. The correctness is the whole point. It is also, strangely, the more satisfying ending. You are allowed to leave a door open without owing anyone a timeline for walking through it. I have not slammed anything shut with Curtis, and I have not rushed to rebuild what 32 years never actually built in the first place. The door is open a few inches, exactly as far as feels honest to me right now, and I get to decide slowly whether it opens wider. If you are sitting in a similar in-between place with someone in your own life, Uncertain whether reconciliation is owed or even wanted, I hope you give yourself the same permission I finally gave myself. You do not have to choose between total forgiveness and total silence. There is an entire door's width of space in between, and you are allowed to stand in it for as long as you need to. If this story meant something to you, I want you to think of your own Vivian, the person who noticed you when they had no obligation to, and I want you to tell them if you still can. There's another story in the description, one that starts at a family reunion and ends somewhere much quieter. Subscribe if stories like this one matter to you, and drop a comment telling me who showed up for you when the people who were supposed to never quite did. I read every one. And if you've ever sat in a room holding the one piece of paper someone else needed and never expected you to have, tell me about it below. Type blueprint if you know exactly what that feeling is like.